Joe? Joe? Ashish? Are they there? It's not going
Yeah.
live. Have you changed the settings for Facebook going live?
I can't. Ashish will have to. Ashish, you're there?
No, I'm trying to connect to Facebook and it is asking me to sign in. I have to sign in as in Senfa, right?
No, you can also do it from ESG.
Anyway, now the reason I'm doing this.
Share it on the ESG.
No, you didn't get my point. When I click the connect to Facebook, uh, it is asking me to sign in again.
That's because you have signed out from the ESG account.
It used to go directly to Facebook.
I didn't sign in from the CFA account. I use my personal, so I can't kind of do it.
I'll do it.
If you want, I can kind of rejoin signing in from that account.
Has stopped.
Oh yeah, it's there. Sorry.
Just yeah, Bhargavi, you can go live. Right. Hang on. Okay.
Yes, it's saying your life.
Okay, fine. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the webinar series titled Interdisciplinary Action Research Conversations with Emerging Leaders. Today is the fifth in the series. So why these conversations? Well, in a world where the new normal is of masks and physical distancing and work from home, and almost everyone is still adjusting to the lockdowns and unlocking and the containment zones. And we've also started experiencing isolations and quarantines of family and friends and colleagues. And just about everything around us is new, and it requires a fresh rethinking. So, as national and global economies have crashed, and unorganized and informal communities, who constitute a majority of the economic population, are left grievously impaired. And in this climate of despair, various young researchers and activists have been working on emerging trends in interdisciplinary action research, which addresses some of the most pressing issues of our times, and that from various sectors such as urban planning, public health, sociology, ecology, environment, the digital commons, education, migration studies, and so on. So such ideas and exploration deserve public focus. And given the post-pandemic situation and the difficulties to meet and discuss such ideas, CFA and ESG have collaborated to bring to focus various exciting explorations by young researchers from across India. So in this webinar series, we draw attention to such quiet and interdisciplinary efforts by emerging researchers and leaders through in-depth and engaging conversations. And in the process, the series aims to create spaces for interaction between academia and civil society, and also students and the wider public. So these webinars have been scheduled every Thursday, 5 to 6:30 p.m. and have been open to all with prior registration. So thanks once again for joining us. So today's conversation is about migrant health, perspectives, and challenges. Throughout history, humans have migrated as a result of climate, for trade, due to political instability, conflict, natural disasters, religious persecution, development projects such as dams, highways, ports, that most often displace them, and also in search of a better life This internal migration has also become a survival strategy for thousands who are in search of better livelihoods. And that too in the context when farm-based livelihoods are becoming extremely difficult due to a number of reasons. And poverty and indebtedness have been additional reasons that push people out in search of jobs. These migrants face a unique set of challenges in urban areas when they face economic and social and cultural and health challenges. Once in cities, they are made to work for long hours, they are paid low wages, they work in very unsafe environments, besides being socially isolated and have absolutely no access or poor access to basic services such as housing, food, education, water, sanitation, and health. And chronic malnutrition is a huge setback that complicates the problem. Many in the reproductive age group who deliver their babies in areas to where they have migrated to most often fall outside the safety net of the reproductive and child health services of the state. They are unable to avail any of the maternity cash benefit schemes of institutional deliveries, for example, like the Janani Suraksha Yojana. And women migrant laborers also face severe gender-based problems and are subjected to physical, verbal, and sexual abuse too. So given the lack of supportive environment and social systems, this can have a very significant impact on their physical and mental health of most often they're all young migrant men and women. And despite the growing number of migrants into our cities, talking of internal migrants, over the last 3 decades, provisions to address their socioeconomic health needs has remained largely inadequate and often neglected and has been low in the list of priorities. This was very evident when the pandemic and the unplanned lockdown resulted in such chaos that crores who lived on the margins as migrant workers walked home braving harsh summer conditions with very little offered as economic measures to address the crisis that they were facing. And in such a horrific situation, 16 migrant workers were run over by a cargo train while sleeping on the railway track on their way home. 47 of them died out of exhaustion, and many died on the Shramik trains. And a study recently mentions about 900 odd migrant workers eventually lost their life. But what is very appalling and shocking is 3 days back, in a response to a question concerning migrant workers' death and loss of livelihoods in the parliament, the response has been that the center had no data on migrant workers who died as a result of the imposition of the unplanned COVID lockdown. This shows the systemic insensitivity towards migrants while they are slowly returning to their places of work in some states. The challenge remains that the existing policies and laws do not specifically mention legal and social protection of migrant workers in India. Although India is signatory to several ILO conventions, it is yet to ratify the Convention of Migrant Workers that allows a common platform for protecting them. The United Nations Convention on Migrant Workers clearly states various laws on migrants' rights and puts migrants subject as a global issue. But however, India has neither adopted these conventions nor set clear agendas on migrant issues. Therefore, the rights of migrants largely remain unprotected, including the most important aspect of migrant health. The National Health Policy of 2001, which aims to achieve acceptable standard of health among general population with emphasis on equitable access to public health services across the country, does not address migrant health in specific. At present, the National Framework of Health Programs and Policies, there is very little to address the health of migrant workers. And again, coming to the cities, if we look at the city municipalities do not have the systems in place as per the provisions of the Constitutional 74th Amendment to cater to the existing needs of the urban population and the migrant influx is definitely out of their bandwidth. The National Urban Health Mission, which was launched in 2013, also fails to address the urban health needs of the poor and the vulnerable sections in the context of political, economic, and social structures of local governments. While cities are gearing up to be smart cities and healthcare is getting digitized with influx of technologies like AI and telemedicine and so on, whether migrant health will ever be in focus is a question that troubles all of us. To help us understand these questions and more, we have with us today Divya Ravindranath and Abha Rao. Thank you, Divya and Abha, for agreeing to have this conversation with us and share some of your insights into the research that you people have been doing. So to introduce our speakers to all of you, Divya Ravindranath's doctoral work looked at maternal health and child malnutrition in migrant households engaged in construction work. In this ethnographic study, she conducted fieldwork at construction sites in the city of Ahmedabad to study workers' experiences and perceptions of maternal and child health status, households' ability to access healthcare and government programs. Currently, she is a researcher at the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, where her work focuses on the intersection of migrant informal labor, gender, and health. Thank you, Divya, for being part of this. And Dr. Abha Rao has a PhD in family studies and human development with a concentration in medical anthropology from the University of Arizona. She has worked on migrant and refugee issues for 2 decades. Her current area of research is examining the sexual and reproductive health issues of temporary women migrant construction workers. So before I hand over the forum to them, a few housekeeping rules we'll all follow. We keep our cell phones on silent and our mics on mute. We would encourage questions, comments, feedback through the chat box so that it's easy for us to take them. And if there is time and if any of you would like to share your thoughts, do raise your hand or put it in the chat box and we will also give you a chance to speak. So over to Divya, followed by Abha.
Hi, actually, sorry, Abha is going to go first.
Okay.
And then I go after her.
Okay.
Thank you so much for the generous introduction, Bhargavi. And also thank you to everyone who's here today. I really appreciate the sort of the context that you described in terms of the migrant conditions today. A year ago when we started this work, it didn't seem very politically loaded, but right now in view of events over the last few months, it seems to have become a much more politically sort of situation that the country is grappling with. I will talk more specifically, you mentioned a lot of the health issues that they have, and I will talk specifically about the health conditions that afflict them and the conditions that lead to these poor health outcomes and health access for them. I'm going to be sharing a small presentation while I talk along, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right, I hope this is visible to everyone. I'm going to start with a fairly well-known fact. This should not come as a surprise to anybody, that there's huge inequality in India in terms of health access, in terms of health outcomes, such as infant, child, and maternal mortality, life expectancy, rates of diseases, communicable and non-communicable diseases, and so on. It's well known that these axes of disadvantage fall along gender lines, caste lines, literacy, rural, urban status, regional status, and so on. In this presentation, in this talk, I'll mostly focus on the last one, which is about migrant status. I'd like to start with a few advantages there are to migration. One is that often migrants do have better health outcomes in some ways, because when they work in urban areas, they have higher incomes, which allows them to buy better food, seek better healthcare, and so on. They also, living in more urban and more dense areas, have access to health facilities. They have access to food supplies year round, and they have access to more health information due to the variety of social media and other forms of media that are available in urban areas that they might not have access to in rural areas. But the consequences, the negative consequences of migration upon health are much more severe, right? They have higher rates, so migrants have higher rates of communicable diseases, primary among them tuberculosis, which is a challenging disease even at the best of times to detect and treat. When it comes to migrant laborers, it's even more severe to detect them and treat them. The treatment is long term, and the fact that they're returning to their hometowns and returning to urban areas on a circular basis makes it harder for them to identify and treat them on a long term basis. They are more liable to develop non-communicable diseases such as um, cardiovascular disease and diabetes. This has to do often with the change in diet that they experience after they move to an urban area, as well as the stresses of living in urban areas. They are more, uh, have a greater risk of vector-borne diseases, malaria and dengue, from the kinds of places that they live in, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And there's a lot of diseases that come straight away from living in poor living conditions, where there's limited access to sanitation facilities, such as skin conditions, RTIs, reproductive tract infections, and urinary tract infections for women that result from living in these spaces. They are at a much greater risk for occupational hazards, given the kind of work that they do. And there's also the risk of social violence. There's a lot of rhetoric around migrants and them being outsiders. There's a lot of othering of migrants, and that increases their risk of violence. Some of these consequences are especially severe for children. Divya will talk a little bit more about some of these factors, about breastfeeding, that they have shorter durations of breastfeeding, they have a higher risk of mortality, lower rates of immunization, higher rates of acute respiratory infections and diarrhea, and poorer nutrition, all in all. So in addition to these, they're at a higher risk of sexually transmitted diseases and alcoholism and so on. So there are a lot of factors which actually increase the risks of migration for health, and they far outweigh whatever benefits there might be to migration. Now, there's a lot of reasons that migrants suffer from such poor health. One would be the inadequate awareness of public health schemes and entitlements, or even if they were aware of them, there's a lot of challenges related to the interoperability of identity cards and access cards when they move across states in order to find employment. They have limited contact with public health facilities because often, migrant settlements are on the very edge of established settlements in cities. So they have limited access to government health facilities. They rarely come in contact with public health workers and so on. They are the nature of work that that migrants do. I called it the 3 Ds, and there's an additional D. The work that they do tends to be dangerous, dirty, and difficult. And in the Indian context of caste, it often is demeaning as well. All of these factors, whether the work that they do is more dangerous, it's more dirty, it's more difficult, and it's more demeaning, all of which makes it hard, increases the risk of poor health outcomes and decreases the chances that they'll be able to seek care for it. I mentioned living conditions in the last slide. Any of us who live in urban areas are well aware of these blue tent cities. You just have to look at a Google map of your city from a satellite view, and you'll see a range of blue tents, tarpaulins, that are spread in pockets across the city. These tend to be in low-lying areas where they flood annually during the monsoons. Garbage tends to collect on the edges of these camps. The houses themselves are made of structurally poor materials and are packed very close together, which increases the risk of communicable diseases such as tuberculosis. And they are subject to a great deal of stress. Some of this stress is due to the nature of the work that they do. There's meager income. They don't make a whole lot of money. They're subject to exploitation by contractors and others. There's a lack of job security. So they might come for some jobs, but then find that it's abruptly ends partway through their work, and then they have to find something else. And some of it are more psychosocial stresses that have to do with displacement, with adaptation to a new location, as I mentioned, there's attacks from outsiders or prejudiced views of migrant workers as well. There are cultural and linguistic barriers that might hinder their ability to seek care, especially if they come from out of state. And given that a lot of migrant workers are wage laborers, so they're daily wage laborers, it is hard for them to take a few hours or a day off. There is no question of taking a few hours off because they get paid on a daily basis in order to seek care, even if they are in need of health care. Now, I want to make a clarification that there's a difference between the long-term migrant workers and the temporary migrant workers. A lot of the literature that I've just shared with you is actually, it doesn't make this distinction. It clubs all workers together in one place. But we do know that the outcomes for temporary workers, or what you'd call circular workers, short-term workers, are worse than they are for long-term workers. In fact, there's a bunch of evidence that suggests that as you stay longer in one place, that the benefits sort of accrue and the costs of migration start outweighing the benefits of it. But for temporary workers, their life is exacerbated by the impermanency. They never get a chance to become permanent. They never get a chance to become long-term migrants. So they are forever temporary workers who never end up benefiting from migration in the long term. Let me talk a little bit more about this population. Who are they? India has about 450 odd million internal immigrants. That's 1 in 3 Indians is considered a migrant because they live in a place that they were not born in. Who are temporary migrants? They are about 10% of this 1/3 of India's population, which is about 45 or 50 million. But estimates range, 15 million to 100 million, depending on how you measure temporariness. So somebody who works for 5 days a week in the urban area, but then goes back to their home for 2 days a week, is that temporary work? Is somebody who goes on a monthly basis, so ends up spending 6 months at a time in one place and the other, is that temporary work? There's a lot of definitional confusion around this, and it's really hard to identify how many people actually meet the criteria for temporary migrants. What is clear, though, is that the people who are temporary migrants, they have a lot of social disadvantages compared to those who are long-term or permanent migrants. So they tend to be poorer, they tend to have lower levels of literacy, they are more likely to be landless. They tend to be lower caste. In other words, their social vulnerability of migrants, that migrant status overlaps with other forms of social and economic disadvantage. They have very few policy protections. This community, there are very few, first of all, there's very few laws that even protect migrants generally. One of the pre-existing ones is the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act from 1979. This is a fairly obsolete act. It's supposed to set out protections in terms of employment, working conditions, and so on. And it was formulated in response to exploitative working conditions for migrants moving across state boundaries. But it's not really well enforced. And most importantly, it does not address within state migrants who make up a majority of migrants today. So let's take a closer look once again at temporary migrants, but looking at a subset of them, construction workers. Now, construction workers are largely comprised of temporary migrants, and construction is the largest single sector area of employment for temporary migrants. Now, a few additional laws come into play here. There is the 1996 Act on Building and Other Construction Workers Act. It is supposed to have provisions for labor and economic and other well-being protections. So labor protections involving working hours, protective equipment that is given to them, economic in terms of pay, overtime pay, and so on, and well-being protection in terms of access to clean drinking water, sanitation facilities, and so on. This law is has somewhat more presence than the 1979 Act, but the limitation of it is that it applies only to work sites of a certain size. And a lot of construction that happens in India are smaller work sites that simply do not have to meet the conditions of this act. And in Karnataka, for instance, only 25% of construction workers work in the larger formal sector, construction sector, where they would be covered by this act. The majority of them simply do not fall under the provisions of this act. The consequences for work is once again well known. for temporary migrants, for temporary construction workers, in that they tend to work longer hours, take on harder jobs, and often for lower wages. And the harder labor and the longer hours results in understandable health conditions, occupational health hazards that are associated with them. And now I'm going to focus on even more specific subset of temporary migrant construction workers, which is the women here, which is my area of interest and Divya's as well. So women migrants actually make up a majority of Indian migrants in general, primarily due to marriage migration. They've moved elsewhere to another place after marriage. They actually comprise only 15% of construction workers. So the construction industry is largely dominated by temporary men construction workers. But nonetheless, they're highly visible on construction sites. We just have to go past any construction site to see that they are often doing very simple and yet very demanding jobs. They're carrying bricks, they're carrying cement, they're laying stones, and so on. There are very specific conditions for women, right? Construction work in general, of course, it's very repetitive. It can lead to all sorts of musculoskeletal disorders. It leads to hearing loss due to construction noise. It leads to skin diseases. There are all sorts of well-known consequences to construction work. Now, women have they have the same problems and more as well. The work that they do is especially repetitive. The carrying of bricks and stones. The wages that they make are lower because it's considered unskilled labor, even though they're never given the opportunity to develop skills related to construction. And not only is their wages lower, they have less access to it. Now, women construction workers are typically not traveling on their own. They've not come on their own to an urban area to work in construction. They typically come as part of a couple or as part of a family. And the daily wages or the weekly wages, when they're handed out, are often given to the male head of household. So there are many women who actually don't even know exactly how much they make given over the course of a week, because they do not actually see a lot of it. There are specific health issues that affect women, and a lot of it resulting from the lack of sanitation facilities related to reproductive tract and urinary tract infections. Over and above this, women construction workers, and I suppose this is true for women workers everywhere, but they face the risks of sexual harassment on work sites, both from other workers, construction workers, and from building contractors and supervisors at work sites. And another issue that they struggle with, and that all women do, I suppose, is that of the second shift. So many construction workers, when you talk to them, the women, they often wake up well before construction work starts for the day, or stay up late in order to do the regular household chores and to provide childcare and so on. So all of these, in other words, migrant women workers end up working well over 8-10 hours that they actually spend doing construction work. Their days are long. My field work, as Bhargavi mentioned, has mostly been in Bangalore. The context for this in the last few months is that migrants in general are subject to a lot of hostility from established residents who feel like they're displacing them, who are taking work that the locals should be doing. And resulting from this sort of suspicion is that there are regularly clearance drives on the suspicion of illegality. Now, the reasons for why they suspect these migrant workers are often very spurious, and are just used as a way of clearing urban spaces for development. Many of them talk about like how their access to basic services such as rations and so on are limited by locals who view them as outsiders, who say that they are taking resources that are intended for us. So they work in this environment of hostility. My own work has been on 2 field sites in Bangalore. One has been in the southeast part of the city along Sarjapur Road, where there's a lot of construction, a lot of tech industry, and a lot of construction related to that, both office spaces and huge apartment complexes. The other area has been in the northeast part of the city, in the Kalkere area, which is a little more amorphous than what we see along Sarjapur Road, a little more spread out. So I've been working in these communities for about a year now, although work has recently been halted for the last few months due to the pandemic. Introductions were made with the help of 2 non-government organizations, one in each area that work here. And after that, I've been visiting these communities, once or twice a week over a period of several months. The first few visits were just made to meet people, to introduce ourselves, make our faces familiar to them, chit chat with them, chit chat with the men. I was mostly interested in talking to the women, but you end up talking to other members of the community, the older ones, the children, and so on. And children give you a lot of information, so it was always good to catch up with them as well. I conducted observations, so walked around the communities, mapping out what these settlements look like. And eventually I got down to doing interviews with some of the women who met my research sort of agenda, which I'll talk about towards the end of this presentation. I'm going to share a few photos of the settlements that I have lived in, that I have worked in. These are settlements that you drive past every day, and you don't realize necessarily from the main road how much farther and how much deeper they go in, right? So here is a picture of a typical migrant settlement. You can see that there are, as I described, they're often made with these blue tarps and leftover building materials. They are typically made of very temporary materials: bamboo, metal sheets, tin sheets, asbestos sheets, packed mud some places. The roofing is almost always this blue tarp or some other form of tarpaulin material, plastic material that's thrown on top. The flooring is packed mud for the most part, although I did come across a few instances of concrete, of concretization. These houses are, it's a standard almost 10 by 10 kind of space, but the pictures that are featured here are even smaller than that. The walls are made of the same material. The houses are packed very, very close to each other. There are few public spaces for people to meet, so they end up meeting in the passages between the houses. And there is very limited sanitation facilities in any of these areas. Over the last few months, I visited over 15 or 20 sites, even though we've ended up doing research on only a handful of them. And the lack of sanitation facilities is about the most common feature across all of these spaces. Inside the houses, though, it's quite amazing to see. I have just a handful of pictures here of how the houses are organized. You can see the houses, the materials that the houses are made with, right? Sticks, bamboo, leftover wood, sheets, and so on. But, people make themselves comfortable where they can. So there's little racks made, once again, from a leftover door in the picture on the left. Almost all of them have indoor cooking stoves that they make with packed mud. So these little chulhas. Some of them have a chimney directly above, which allows the fumes to escape and the smoke to escape. But most are quite dark inside, and they do not have any windows. They do not have any ventilation. Don't be misled by how well lit these photographs look, because they're quite dark inside. The biggest problem that you see, as I mentioned, is the lack of sanitation facilities in these spaces. The picture on the left is on the edge of one of these settlement camps, and you can see it overlooks a road right behind it. And this is the part of the camp which people use for their sanitation purposes. So this is where they urinate and defecate. It's also a garbage dump, as you can see. There's very limited privacy here. And you'll hear women say that they go in groups of 2 or 3 in order to prevent, peeping eyes and harassment and so on. The picture on the right is standing water that you see. This was not actually during the rainy season. As you see, look around it, you can see that it's fairly dry at the time. This is water that's left standing from, from bathing, from washing dishes, from washing clothes. There are a lot of mosquitoes in these areas, and I mentioned earlier that they're at a great risk of vector-borne diseases like malaria and dengue due to the huge amount of standing water that you see in regular intervals in these settlements. The picture on the left here, and the right for that matter, is where people typically take their baths. So this is a slightly raised platform with a hole in one area. And the walls are made up of sheets, corrugated cardboard and metal. They're open to the sky, usually. There's one shower area, so to speak, for every 10 homes or so. As you can see, this offers very limited privacy. People have to carry their own water inside. They have very limited access to water. And there are a lot of pests here. Nearly every woman that we spoke to said that there are a lot of mice that plague them when they're taking their baths. These are very unsafe spaces for women to work in. I previously talked about how outsiders and locals, locals view them as outsiders and are suspicious of them. In one of the camps that we visited, there is actually a sanitation facility. There are 3 toilets that you can see that have been built for their use, because this is a longer, it's not a permanent settlement by any stretch of imagination. It's still quite temporary, but it's been a long-term temporary facility, and 3 toilets were built here. But the outsiders, the locals who live here, viewed the outsiders as, you know, fouling their space and did not want them using it. So you can, if you look a little closer, you can see the first 2 doors are locked, and the 3rd bathroom, which I took a peek in, is essentially unusable. So people end up using the spaces outside again. This is sort of the context in which the temporary workers live and work. And so, like I said, the fieldwork was ongoing before things sort of came to an abrupt stop, and I hope to get back out there once things open up again. There are broader issues related to health and healthcare access, as I mentioned early in the talk, that there's limited ability to use their public health and nutrition entitlements. Bhargavi mentioned, you know, Janani Suraksha Yojana in the beginning, and I've had a lot of discussions related to their ability to use ration cards to access food rations and so on. I want to have a better understanding of how, you know, the sort of the conditions of construction work, the conditions that they live and work in, and the limited wages that they have, how all of these combine, specifically in the case of women, to worsen their healthcare outcomes and their healthcare access. I'm specifically interested in looking at the consequences resulting from a lack of access to sanitation facilities, as I mentioned, reproductive tract infections, urinary tract infections. You know, a lot of women report simply not drinking enough water because there's no place for them to urinate safely. There's a lot of complications related to when they have their, when they're menstruating, in terms of access to menstrual pads, in terms of safe spaces to dispose of them, and so on. There are challenges with access to water, so washing clothes regularly, and how does that impact their personal health? I'll be taking a closer look at these questions when the opportunity arises again. I'm going to close out here. I just wanted to sort of set the, give a description of the conditions that migrant workers live and work in. Divya is going to speak a little bit more about the challenges of doing research with this population. I just want to thank Azim Premji University, who support the research grants support my work. I want to thank Gubachi and Biaghar, which are 2 non-government organizations that have helped me access migrant populations. And I want to thank my research assistant, Akshita, who's been very helpful in conducting interviews. Thank you so much. Thanks, Bhargavi, and Divya, over to you.
Thank you, Abha. Over to you, Divya.
Thanks, Bhargavi. It's really nice being here because both Bhargavi and Leo have been amongst my earliest mentors when I started off more than a decade ago, straight out of college. Thanks for inviting me. It feels special to be presenting in front of your own mentors. Thanks, Abha, because she set the context really well. And I'm just going to give examples by the way of 2 studies, one that I did in the past and one that is ongoing. So I'm just going to pick up a lot from what Abha has already said and show you how all that she said actually starts impacting women and what are the implications in terms of the health outcomes, both for women and children. So sort of following up on a lot of things that she's already said. I'm just going to share my presentation. So the 2 things that, you know, the first study was looking at maternal health experiences and access to healthcare services. In particular, we were interested in knowing how do women access healthcare during, you know, the period of pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum care, and so on. The second part of the study also looked at child nutritional status, and I'll explain why it is important to study something like this a little later. And we also wanted to understand how, you know, migrant workers faced, what kinds of barriers they faced when they tried to access maternal health and nutrition programs while living in the city. just giving you sort of a broad brush example of the place that the study had taken place in. So what you see in yellow, Ahmedabad, is where I had conducted all my field work, and what you see in red are all the places from which migrant workers actually come to the city of Ahmedabad. So if you follow the red spots, you will see that it's clustered around Rajasthan, Gujarat, and Madhya Pradesh, which is also a continuous tribal belt. And there's Satna and a few places in Chhattisgarh, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, West Bengal, and so on. So it's a fairly spread out, continuum of migration corridors, if one would like to call it so. What does the sample look like in the study? So most women were within the age group 15 to 25. A lot of them, actually a majority, belong to the social caste groups of scheduled caste and scheduled tribe groups. There were also families from the other backward classes, but in most of these families, the women did not work. So there's a fair distinction in how work is organized at the construction sector. The population is mostly low literacy, and I'm just giving you sort of snapshot of what the population looked like without going into the absolute details of it. Most of the women undertook unskilled work and were paid less than minimum wages. As Abha was already saying, very often it is men who are paid the wages that the couple sort of undertakes together. The men are paid for it, and as a result, women don't actually know how much money they've earned for the work they have done. In Ahmedabad, there is also another interesting system of kharchi, as what it is called in the local language, which actually implies that the worker takes money in advance from their own wages from the contractor. And over a period of time, workers either lose track of how much advance has been taken, or the contractor has not kept the right account. And very often they end up owing the contractor a lot more than they actually have taken in terms of a debt. And so debt and remittances then become the biggest sort of spaces where they end up using all their wages. Now, quickly going into some results that we found in terms of maternal health experiences. A majority of the women in the sample that we studied experienced some kind of morbidity or the other. And if you look at just the red ones that I've highlighted here, a little less than 50% of women were underweight, and this included women who were also pregnant. Now, one thing to remember about both maternal health and child health is that there are very large intergenerational sort of effects that one could see. And when the mother is underweight or has health issues, very often it sort of gets transmitted to the child because there is an intergenerational effect. And so we are talking about women who are already, children who are already beginning at a disadvantage right from the stage of being in the mother's womb. One of the things that really struck us was how low the antenatal care, access to antenatal care was. Most women did not end up having more than one checkup during pregnancy, and it was sort of perceived in various ways. In some households, for example, because economic security is such a big issue, they did not think of antenatal care as a necessary expense for the family, as a result of which fewer women went to the doctor. 32% of the women said they did not, and this is a small sample, but I'll talk about what it means to sort of gather information like this at construction sites a little later. 32% of the women that we had spoken to did not have institutional births. That is, they either had childbirth back home in the villages or at the construction site where they were working, and in the middle of the night there's a childbirth and they can't run to the hospital, and so on. Limited postpartum care, and this is sort of a very interesting finding, because when we think about women's postpartum care, family ties play a very important role for many of us who think of going back to the maternal home for childbirth. But when women are in the city, especially for shorter periods of time, they lose access to that caregiving environment, especially post-childbirth. And so very often we see women returning within, a week or two of childbirth back to work. And as Abha pointed out, construction work requires a lot of physical exertion, a lot of it's a laborious work, as a result of which women immediately start feeling the impact of these kinds of tasks on their bodies and on their health. As I already said, that economic insecurity and irregular wage patterns were sort of the biggest reasons why women did not seek to access care while being pregnant, or institutional birth as well being very expensive in private homes. And the fact that a lot of construction work today in many cities is occurring at the periphery of the city, as a result of which they're cut off from what would be the traditional hotspots of public health centers, the big government hospitals and so on, because the infrastructure is not catching up at the same level, especially in the peripheries of the city, which are sort of developing these what would you call them, gated communities and large housing complexes that will eventually have private nursing homes. And as a result of this, public health access immediately starts reducing for women. Lack of familiarity with public health systems was a big issue, as Abha pointed out. And because dependence on private healthcare services increases, they're also far more expensive, and automatically that reduces the number of visits a family is able to make to the doctor. Abha has already spoken about it, so I won't reiterate some of these things, but I just wanted to try and put all of these conditions in the perspective of women's health. So if you see the woman on the right carrying a cement bag, the average weight of bricks or cement that they carry at a time ranges anywhere between 50 to 75 kgs, could go up to 100. And there's an interesting study that Ajivika Bureau, one of the organizations that I work very closely, they have been doing in the recent past, where they looked at how much weight a woman carries, and it ranges somewhere to to the range of 700 to 1,000. Of course, not at a stretch, but the number of times the woman picks up, things that are heavy and puts it down. And so imagine the kind of repercussions that has on the woman's body, and especially when she's at the stage of pregnancy or childbirth, or even when, pre-pregnancy, if she's still in her teens, because they start work quite early as well. So imagine the kind of impact it is likely to have on a woman's body. Just sort of bringing attention to the experiences of children among migrant households. This was another study where we looked at, undernutrition rates. And I wanted to sort of bring your attention to children in particular, because when we think about migrant families, we do not think of children as being important sort of people who move with their families, right? But when there is a family-based migration, which is more common among tribal households, with women are likely to work, are likely to be a part of the labor market, children become a part of the migration that the family undertakes. Extended care from parents and so on. Any other site where migrants are likely to be working. And when the data is very labor centric, automatically we are unable to think about what kind of interventions we require when the child is present at a environment where parents are working along with their children. Now, very rough estimates, again, just to point out that when we talk of migration, all estimates that we give nowadays are very rough, because the last we collected this data was over a decade ago. So we are just working with all kinds of numbers here, but one of the rough estimates suggests that it could be anywhere between 10 to 15 million children, which is a fairly large number for a country like ours. And if you look at malnutrition, also, and again, a side note here, the fact that India is among the top rankers in terms of malnutrition in the world. We fare far worse than some of the other poorer countries and our neighboring countries. And one of the populations that sort of falls through the crack always are migrant children, because they are neither at the source nor at the destination, for a long stretch of time, especially construction work, where labor mobility is sort of tied to the cycle of the construction site. So they are here for a year, another place for another year, and so on. And so it becomes really difficult to make sure the child has consistent access to government programs like the ICDS and so on. And I'll talk a little more as we move ahead. So just sort of putting this chart out there, among the children that we measured, 131 kids, 40% were stunted, which is a fairly high percentage. Over 50% were underweight, and 22% were wasted. Now, what are the big issues in terms of child health in the context of migration and maternal health? So this is one part, and I'll also talk to you about a newer study that we are doing where we are looking at this a little more in depth. One of the big challenges we found was around the idea of breastfeeding. And I'll talk a lot more as we move along, but just sort of putting it out here as an introduction. Very early introduction of food and drink to children, because mothers are busy at the site. Very often children are not allowed at the site. or if they are allowed, the woman is not allowed to take breaks and so on. So then food and drink is very early initiated into the child's diet. There's very limited dietary diversity at home. So it's generally a lot of carbohydrates, lesser protein, and so on. And a very high dependency on packaged food like chips, biscuits, and so on among kids, because that's sort of the easiest food that's available when mothers are working very long hours at the construction site. Abha has already spoken about it, so I won't go too much in depth on it. But one of the things I want you to focus here on is the immunization record, the fact that families are constantly moving and they're unable to keep a track of immunization. So, one thing is to talk about health in the long term, but even in the short term, just immediately after childbirth, the child loses out on a lot of immunizations that are absolutely critical for the safety of the child. In terms of access to public programs, because of their migratory status, they are unable to access. Domicile is always a contentious issue in the way our public policy is designed. So whether it is, the Janani Suraksha Yojana or the maternity benefits program, which is sort of one of the smallest opportunities for women in informal work to access any kind of government program, both of these do not, help migrant women access them easily. There are also very tough conditionalities that are built in. So, a woman has to show that she has had X number of antenatal care checkups to be able to get money under the policy and so on. And there are reasons why this sort of conditionality is put in. But in the case of migrant women, these conditionalities fall flat because women are constantly moving and are unable to show that continuity in their, care and so on. The ICDS model plays out a very critical role. So in some construction sites, you have access to childcare because of not-for-profit organizations and so on, but those are far few, and you will not really find them in many construction sites. Also, the really big ones who are maybe under pressure from their stakeholders or have corporate social responsibility. So there are very few in number who will actually run these kinds of creches, but fewer, you don't see them everywhere in the city. So most of the children go without any kind of care. The second study that I wanted to quickly touch upon is on mothers' time use and breastfeeding practices. And I'll really go very quickly on this because I just wanted to sort of give you a glimpse on the kind of research one does at migrant, with migrant communities, and the kind of challenges it also imposes for us to do any kind of work in environments like this. As we know, exclusive breastfeeding is absolutely critical in the first 6 months of the childbirth. It also has benefits for maternal care. But what Abha said, and I'll sort of reiterate that a lot of women experience the double burden of care. In fact, I would say triple burden of care, where it is childcare, household chores, as well as the construction work that they do. And this poses a huge acute, time stress on the woman, because of which she's unable to take care of her newborn child. But all the literature that you see around breastfeeding, all the government programs that you see around breastfeeding will constantly keep harping about the benefits of exclusive breastfeeding for the children, without even once thinking about the migrant woman or thinking about a woman as a worker. So the assumption in all our policy documents is that the woman is a mother and has nothing else to do, so she can look after her child, for any extended period of time. But the reality for a lot of these women is that they're working in informal work sites where they don't have that environment in which they can actually look after their children. As a result of this, breastfeeding becomes absolutely impossible for many women. We also need to realize that breastfeeding in particular is a very time-consuming, time-intensive process, which can become economically costly for women if they have to take a break from work and just focus on breastfeeding for the first 6 months. And so we sort of talked to women about what are the ways in which they were thinking about breastfeeding and what kind of implications did it have for them. And here's just a quick, so when we think about policy, generally, there are these suggestions that you build a creche and women will be able to do better. You provide a creche facility and the women will be able to come back there to breastfeed their child. But some of these things we sort of wanted to, push and think a little more about what do these kind of interventions really mean? Do they really benefit women who are with children who are younger than 6 months? And what are the ways in which those challenges continue to exist? So I just wanted to use, exclusive breastfeeding as an example, but also talk about all the surrounding things that start affecting the woman's ability to breastfeed, especially when she's at an informal work site. Sorry, one second. So one is the nature of work. As Abha was saying, women's work is very intensive at the construction site. Very often it is the most menial, most low-skilled sort of work that is given to women. So it's also physically more intensive. That can have huge impacts in her ability to breastfeeding, because we know that a woman needs adequate rest, water, food to be able to breastfeed. And all of those things are sort of impacted because of the kind of work she does. The other big issue is that of wages, because the maternity benefits program only gives 6,000 rupees, and now it has become 5, but when it started off, it was 6. For a period of 6 months, she would make a lot more money if she just worked. So wages are a reason why she's not willing to take that break. Also, a lot of workers experience surveillance, and each of their, every minute of their work is sort of paid close attention to by contractors and so on, as a result of which they are unable to take breaks. Fewer construction sites do allow women, 2 breaks a day, 3 breaks a day. But at most, we have found that they have to, if they started a work, they have to finish it. So whether it's by piece or whether it's by the quantity that has been, already decided by the contractor, as a result of which she's unable to take a break. Access to water and sanitation, Abha has already talked about it, so I'm not going to go too much in depth on that. Very often, older children and creches play critical roles in facilitating care for the child, but don't necessarily enable exclusive breastfeeding. So there will be an older child who is within the family or has been brought from, a relative or so on, who looks after the child. So the care part is taken care of, but in terms of exclusive breastfeeding, the child still needs the mother, and that's something that's impossible at a construction site. The contractor plays a huge role. We've also realized that while the contractor can make the life of a construction worker really difficult, a lot of workers also depend on personal relationships and the benevolence of the contractor to enable women to actually take breaks and breastfeed their child. So that relationship, where it is sort of a paternalistic role that the contractor takes and says, okay, go for 10 minutes, feed your child and come back. So that sort of negotiation is constantly a part of the women's daily schedule. And the big question that women always want to know is, if we can't breastfeed, then what's the next question? But the way our policies around breastfeeding are written, all the ICDS centers, all daycare centers constantly keep telling the woman that you have to breastfeed the child, without giving her the alternative of time or options that could go into the child's diet. Finally, social protection, of course, as I said, maternity benefits program, the Janani Suraksha Yojana, and several other smaller sort of, programs that have been over the last few years that have been facilitated are not accessible to these women because of domicile status, but also because women simply, that the kind of money that these programs give are simply insufficient. Also the fact that women are constantly moving not just between the city and the village, but also multiple times within the city. So one of the things that we also want to ask is, when we are fighting for sort of universalization of a lot of these schemes, even in that conversation, a lot of us, inbuilt in our assumptions is the fact that migrants want to eventually settle in the city. So there is this assumption of incrementally staking a claim in the city. But for these migrant workers, especially in the construction side, because labor mobility is constantly tied to the site cycle, that kind of settlement is not something they want, simply because their work demands that they constantly keep moving from one side to the other. So it's also a huge challenge for those of us who are doing advocacy work, those of us who are doing policy work, you start thinking a little beyond these, very binary claims that we make about a migrant and a rural individual and an urban individual and so on. Because in the case of, certain occupations, mobility is sort of fundamental to the way the work occurs. And so it's very important for us also to sort of step out of those binaries and think a little more creatively in what kind of policy suggestions we could make. I'm just going to end with sort of the big challenges that we encounter in fieldwork and data collection. As you know, construction sites are very heavily guarded spaces. There are contractors, there are security guards. Finding entry is a huge challenge. And so like Abha in Ahmedabad, I have used the help of not-for-profit organizations to help me get in. And so the people that we are interviewing, the people that we are measuring in terms of their anthropometric measures and so on, remember that they're already better off because to some extent the site is giving them some facilities, water, sanitation, or daycare, and so on. So those sites where we don't have access, probably the condition is far worse because they are so gated and so tied up, and there's no way for us to know what's going on inside. One of the big challenges that we face as researchers is to think of the site of work, the woman's site of work as our site of research. How do you do this kind of work when there are so many barriers to entry? And what does the setting up look like? How do you sort of convince the contractor, the builder, the fact that your research could actually feed into some kind of interventions that the employer can also think of. The other big challenge is also, of course, interaction with contractors and even family members, because very often it could feel like there is surveillance. Though I'm happy to take if there are any questions on that, because I've had several of those questions coming to me at different seminars. The other thing is that, a lot of the time people who do qualitative research work, ethnographers and so on, tend to be very embedded in a community. But in the case of construction workers or migrant workers, because they are so mobile, it is very tough for us to become embedded within a community context, right? So then their context becomes the point where you embed yourself as a researcher. So when I go to a new construction site, it isn't the same people. There are new contractors, new workers, new builders, new site of work, and so on. And so then it really becomes important for us as researchers to know that our information and knowledge of what construction work looks like is the way forward to sort of build quicker and newer ties. So it's not being embedded in the community in some sense, but in the context in which all of these communities come together for short periods of time. The other big question is the question of ethics around this kind of research. How do we think about consent? How do we sort of think about what kind of information we want to give out when we are doing research, not to the participant, but to people around who are asking us questions about what is the kind of research we are doing, and if we tell the truth, then what is the kind of impact it will have on the people we are trying to work with. So these are very important ethical concerns, and a lot of this research can seem very intrusive in nature. So there's a lot of checks and balances we need to put in place. These are questions we need to try and address before we enter any work site. And for researchers in particular, there will be many moments when we do this kind of research where you feel challenged, and what researchers are really obsessed about, the sanctity of a method. This is the point at which you realize that the agency of the participant sort of trumps the sanctity of the method. So there are ways in which you have to creatively think outside of the standardized methods that one uses to do this kind of research, simply because you want to be able to capture populations that are not easy to access, are more vulnerable than the others, and so on. I think I'll stop there, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you, Divya, for that amazing presentation, and thanks, Abha, again for detailing every little bit of the challenges that you all are going through as you move ahead with your research. So to start off, a simple question: why did you choose migrant health as your topic of research? Abha, you want to go first?
Sure. I've had a long-standing interest, I suppose, in migrant and refugee issues. I've done it in different contexts with different populations and so on. But here in Bangalore, it feels unavoidable. I suppose it's the same in places like Gurgaon and Hyderabad, where there's a lot of construction. And I got into it the way anyone does. I think we're all curious about the people that we see who come and live for a little while, build, like a stilt plus 3-story house, and then they move on. So it was just personal curiosity, but it's one of those things which, as I mentioned, it's very easy to avoid knowing more about their lives because it's very tucked away. But once you sort of enter the context, once you sort of enter the community, you start getting more and more curious about their lives. So it was simple research curiosity, I think, that led me here.
Thank you. Divya?
So I think I wasn't thinking really about migrant workers when I started off. It was mostly to think about informal work and health. And then you end up realizing that a lot of sectors, informal work by default means migrant workers. And then you can't not talk about migration as sort of one of the key, things that affect the way people experience health outcomes. So I think that was sort of the backside route that I got introduced to migration literature, but otherwise it was mostly about informal work and health. So I do some work with domestic workers also, and those issues are very different. because the way domestic workers are organized in our cities, they are semi-permanent migrants, if you still want to call them, at least the state wants to call them so. But otherwise, they are sort of more settled. So even within informal work sectors, there are such different ways of thinking about what these workers are doing and how their health outcomes are impacted because of their status in the city and so on.
Thank you. Abha, since you also have some experience with refugees, would you like to share a little bit about that?
This was a while ago, and it wasn't in India, actually. It was abroad. It was in New Zealand, where I was working with refugees who come to New Zealand. Often African refugees. There was a lot of Ethiopian refugees at that time. And I was working at an organization for a few months that served refugee populations in terms of helping them access social services and social benefits. A lot of refugees come with limited levels of literacy, or perhaps limited levels of literacy in English, which they would need to fill out forms and to reach out to people. So I filled in a little bit of a role of that, the in-between, go-between, to help them stay in touch with them. This was a while ago, I will admit, but it was a very, it helped me realize that the experiences of migrants and refugees often get lumped together in a lot of descriptions, and it helps you realize is that the psychosocial aspects of being a refugee are very, very different and require very different programs to address them. I think we're seeing a lot of this on the boundaries of our country right now. I mentioned during the talk that there was a lot of suspicion of illegals in Bangalore, and using that suspicion, they cleared a lot of migrant settlements. If you recall, this happened in Bangalore. It was in the news a while ago about how there were suspicions of Rohingyas who had settled in Bangalore's settlements, and they used that as an excuse to clear them out. Subsequent investigation showed that they had no authority to clear out these camps, and that most of the residents of these camps, not that it should matter, but were actually Indians themselves. And how sort of, and here you can see the spillage of refugee issues into migrant issues in our country, I think.
Thank you. So moving to some questions that have started to come in the chat box. So Ashok is asking, what about access to welfare schemes of state and central governments that migrants have? Maybe both of you can respond.
So it's a little complex, right? Because a lot of these policies are sort of dissembled, through state governments, but state governments do not want to serve people who are coming from other states, except for maybe Kerala, which has a little more, a more detailed process to go through this, way of delivery. But in other states, very often I've heard people in the labor department say, why should we give schemes to people who are coming from Rajasthan, for example? Because there are budget constraints, there are constraints in the way the programs are designed. So it's of course the passing the buck kind of a situation. And as I said, domicile status becomes the absolute key factor on which all of our policies are built. And so if you don't have documents to prove that you belong to the city, there's no way you will be able to access many of these programs. Even something like ICDS, which is, you would assume it's universal in nature, becomes very difficult because workers live at gated work sites. And very often all of these services are provided in, a quote unquote more settled slum, a notified slum or something like that, and workers are not able to access those spaces because they live in the periphery of the city or are completely cordoned off from the rest of the city. So when we say invisible, they are literally invisible to the state in some sense, and through the programs and the services. And also, the fact that the current crisis has brought so much attention to migration and migrant workers. And the biggest fear many of us who do this kind of research is that it will just go back to what it was once things are back to normal, simply because they will just become as invisible, behind those large gated walled factories and construction sites and so on. So maybe this is that moment where we need to start thinking of, what could we do to make it better, not just from the government's point of view, but also from the point of view of the employer. So I think in this whole debate, the employers are the ones who generally get away scot-free, because we are so busy sort of thinking of policy and programs and so on, that the responsibility of the employer just sort of doesn't come into existence at all. Though there are, government rules that suggest that the employer must take responsibility.
Abha, you want to add something?
Yeah, I just a quick note, which is that in the communities that I work in, they're actually not interstate migrants. So the construction workers of Bangalore are largely from Northeast Karnataka. So they're from Yadgir, they're from Raichur, they're from, from those districts. So, but the problem, I think, as Divya pointed out, is that, antenatal care and programs that require some sort of commitment over a period of time, even when they're within the same state, is often hard to prove because you're visiting, and to be honest, the public health facilities in these parts of the country are not really great. So they don't have a lot of documentation, incomplete documentation, that even if they were to bring it here, they don't actually have a chance to seek out those services. I'd also like to add that there's just a lot of suspicion, there's a lot of concern about going to a public health facility because a lot of them report being treated poorly because they are migrants. There's a sense that they're taking away resources. Several families that I spoke with discussed talked about fights that broke out, for instance, at ration shops. So they go to collect their monthly ration, and there's a sense that, oh, your card is registered in some other part of the state, and you're coming here and taking our rice and jaggery. So over a period of time, basically it's not worth it to them to get into these fights. And so even though they have legal rights to these services, they're not in a position to comfortably or easily access them.
Thank you. So Ardra Surendran is asking, what is the nature of labor recruitment networks in both the sites? Do contractors play any role in enabling access to public services?
So at least in Ahmedabad, a lot of workers, of course, the networks are really strong. You come through contractors. They are pretty much the people who find you work, who get you to the right work site and so on. So you are dependent on them for basic things like housing, sanitation, and all of that. But it's also really interesting how 50 million people work in this sector and we know so little about them. So Abha was one of the few people that I have met through one of these channels where I got to know that somebody doing research on migration and construction workers, because each of these sectors becomes so difficult to study because these networks are so tight and difficult to sort of break through and get into to work. Construction sites, for example, it's completely controlled by contractors at different levels. And I also want to sort of, pause here for a minute and say, we also have to stop thinking of contractors, what's a good way to put it, as people who are necessarily terrible people, because through our conversations, our interviews, you realize that the sector is so difficult to work in that contractors sometimes are the only people that that workers can go to for any kind of help. Because our cities don't have any other space or any other services that are easily available to people. So it's a very complicated, very complex relationship that is there between the contractor and the worker. And the contractor, from some of the interviews that we've done, also experience a lot of hardships because the sector is also controlled by bigger employers, much bigger builders, who tell them this is the money you get, whether you manage your labor and the services that you're supposed to give with it or not, that's your headache. So the contractor is also trying to cut costs, on the labor because he can't do it on the other things. Sometimes the contractors are also people who have climbed up the ladder. They were workers at some point in time. Then through, these networks, those who are enterprising have become contractors and then have established long-term, networks in other states and other cities and so on. So we also need to stop thinking about contractors necessarily as people who are trying to do, there might be many of them, so I'm not sort of at any point suggesting that it's, but I'm just saying that it's not that black and white, and we need to be open to thinking about the roles of all of these mediators in a sector that is as big as, construction in our country. I would also say that in terms of how do they help workers get access, government, so workers are not registered in most of the construction sites. And there are very particular reasons for it, and we can get into it if anybody is interested. But that automatically means that all the checks that are supposed to happen, safety checks, all of those don't happen, and workers don't get access to any programs because simply they're not registered in the city where they can have a labor card or claim any kind of compensation if there's an accident and so on.
Thank you. Abha, you want to add or? Okay, so there's a question from Jyoti which you had addressed. So she talks about the effective implementation of the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act and says that in Kerala it is the great majority of migrant workers are not recruited through contractors. So do legislations like the ISMW help in holding them responsible?
I'm not very sort of familiar with the Kerala context, so I'm sorry I can't answer for the question here. Yeah, I mean, I don't think I know enough.
Thank you.
Neither am I, but I think the point that Jyoti is bringing up, which is, see, Kerala has actually done a better job than most other states at just sort of tracking its migrant population, which is part of why they had an effective response to accommodating the needs of migrant workers during the lockdown. I think what Kerala does and what other states should do as well is to have a better record of the movement of people in and out of its borders. I don't know, and perhaps they have to work with contractors, I suppose, but as Divya pointed out, the contractor field itself is very spread out. There are informal contractors who come up from within the community. There are those who come downwards from sort of the building, major builders and so on. I think it's a good question. I'm sorry, I don't have a straight answer because it is a very complicated sort of context within which construction happens in India. Sorry, Divya.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think I would like to ask Leo to share his experience with the Bangalore metro workers, the migrants who were stranded, the condition in which they were stranded, especially after the lockdown, and eventually how, again, NGOs in Bangalore helped them out. Leo, are you there? Would you like to share that experience?
Thanks, Bhargavi. And hi, Divya, more than a decade, and nice to see you virtually. So during the lockdown, I had the, what should I say, the unfortunate task of trying to figure out where migrants are and how they're dealing with it. And needless to say, it was pathetic. And one particularly disturbing aspect was about 1,000 workers within a mile of what we call the Silk Board of Bangalore had been without drinking water for 48 hours or more. And once when we went inside, and this was done along with the group Mara, we figured that for several weeks they had absolutely no support. Now this is a project, a mega project where the government is directly involved, European banks are involved, Japanese government is involved. So obviously the standards one expects in taking care of every aspect of a mega construction would be something of a different order than what you would expect from a local contractor. But that also brings me, and this is just going to be a slightly long comment, Bhargavi, if you don't mind.
Yes, sure.
So this also brings me back to my own days as a research assistant. I used to work with Shivakumar. I think he's participating in this conversation today. He now works with the World Bank. When we were looking out at the condition of construction workers, at that time they mostly came from the Dharmapuri and Salem districts. But then now we have a pan-Indian situation where migrants come from northeast of India to the southwest, and it's really become a pandemic of migration. There are many causative factors if you see it from their point of view. There is a breakdown of governance. There has been a lot of disturbance where they live. There's a gross unemployment, especially of the youth. And so these are some of the causative factors. But and of course, on the other side is the fact that the current spate of migration could also be due to climatic changes. Agriculture, as Bhargavi said earlier, is failing colossally. Even when you have a good crop, it means nothing because you don't have enough money, right, across farming India. So it's not just climate crisis, but also an economic crisis, which is what people are steeped in. And so going forward, the India we can envisage is one where millions more will start migrating. Now, the reason I give this background is because what I saw in the 80s and what I saw during the lockdown, if you actually, and listening to what you both share, which was a vivid account of the condition of living of migrant families and communities and so on, nothing seems to have changed. At least in the 80s, we used to call it slavery. Because the conditions you describe are equivalent to slavery. The way in which women are treated, the way in which the kind of work they do. right? So what is wrong with our politics? Why are we afraid of calling a spade a spade? Why don't we just say that this is India enslaving the other India? Why are we afraid of the government? Why are we afraid of holding our politicians accountable? Is this the politics of marginalizing the marginalized because we are afraid?
Abha, Divya, you want to add something to that? And there is also a comment from Joe who says a government which admits that they do not have data on migrant laborers while arresting somebody like Umar Khalid on false charges and asking for police custody because they have to verify data of 11 lakh pages says a lot of the priorities. Hence, we need to keep that in context when we talk about migrant laborers. Joe, would you like to say a couple of words?
No, I mean, I was just kind of putting that in context when we say about, I mean, sorry to put it in that way. I mean, we need to kind of keep in mind that how insensitive this government is when we talk about the data. I mean, they can get away easily by admitting it in the parliament, saying that we don't have data. And except for a few of us kind of putting exclamations and sharing it on the Facebook, I mean, there is nothing that which kind of affects them. So, I mean, that kind of a level of insensitivity is that I wanted to kind of bring in. The two questions that I had was that, I mean, how can we make this government, or for that matter, any government, make them sensitive to the issues of migrant workers? And if they are not sensitive enough, how do we hold them accountable? Because this cannot kind of go on. I mean, Bhargavi in her opening remarks said about hundreds of people who have died in the past months. Who is responsible for that? Who is accountable for that? And the second thing is, I mean, going slightly beyond what Abha and Divya talked about, that what could have prevented the migrant crisis at the magnitude we witnessed in the past months? Was it an absence of policies, or was it bad policies, or was it absence of implementation? What was it?
I think it's a little mix of everything, and it's very tough to sort of pinpoint on, or point towards any one particular thing. Also, this question about how do we make the government respond better. I mean, I don't have an answer for it. These are things that people have been, advocating for. But I also, maybe it's just my the fact that I'm still very early in my career, so I haven't lost hope yet. But things like the RTI, the NFSA, the NREGA, things that were being actively diluted did come to the rescue during COVID times, right? The NREGA became one of the most important sources for employment. So I'm definitely a lot more hopeful that this moment is a good one to sort of try and think about visibilizing. I don't know if that's a word. Making visible the experiences of people that we haven't for all these decades, but also quickly saying that this is for the first time that business has been hit from the side of the employers. So maybe it is also a moment of reckoning for employers to see how things can get better. So I've been doing fieldwork at construction sites for about 5-6 years now. This is the first time that I have received phone calls from employers because they are desperate. The fact that workers have left and work has come to a standstill. So that's sort of closing the loop in some sense. Employers realizing they cannot not afford to have workers, and the fact that they need the workers, even though they previously believed that the workers needed them more. So in some sense, this is also an opportunity to push for greater accountability from private players and so on. I don't know if that's answering your question in any way, but I'm just sort of talking about the general context in which some of us are doing this work. And one of the things about doing research is also then sort of maintaining relationships with contractors and builders. That's one of the biggest lessons that I have learned through my work. The fact that I cannot afford to be not friends with contractors, because that's the only way I will get access to workers. So I don't mean friends in the sense of being real friends, but having that door open for a conversation, because just dependence on the state when the employer has completely shut down is going to make it very impossible for workers to actually access any of the state programs. So it's like a multi-pronged approach in some sense that we have to take when we're doing research and advocacy. And so just the last point before I keep quiet, to Leo's point also, I also think it is necessary in the language and in the way we conduct research that we also think of migrants as people who are exercising their right to migrate and taking migration, undertaking migration as something that they have chosen. So for many people it is the lack of choice, there is distress, but also there is, for many people it is a matter of choice. It is the fact that they have decided to come to the city, in like many of us who have migrated to different parts of the country and the world. Migration is a choice many of them work. For us, when we start thinking about policy, it is not just to say that we need to have more NREGA, we need to have better circumstances in the village, but we need to do it alongside thinking about how we can make it better for them in the urban areas. It is not for us to say let's control migration and make rural areas better, because a lot of these migrants over generations have sort of aspirations of coming to the city. So I think when we also start advocacy, we need to sort of be a little more open-minded and think about various ways in which we make lives better, because we get so invested in fighting on one end of the spectrum, like NREGA then becomes the obsession for an entire generation of researchers. But what if the migrant says, I don't want to live in the village and work? I really want to come into the city for other social and economic sort of reasons. So I think it has to be, I hope that many more people do this kind of research and simultaneously tackle the problem from various different angles, because there are many parts to the story. And very often we are just seeing one part of the story. So all those images we saw in the media were images that called out for help, but we should also be looking at many other images of the resilience of the workers, only to say that they have survived in the cities despite the state and not because of the state. And I think it's very important that we bring out all these conversations simultaneously, so that we stop boxing workers and contractors and employers in sort of single silos of what we imagine the sector and people to be. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Ava, you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to, I don't know if I share all of Divya's optimism. In Karnataka, at least, Divya mentioned that, employers have a better understanding now of how, they need workers just as much as workers need them. In Karnataka, unfortunately, the first response to migrants wanting to go back was to say, no, keep them here, correct? Their bigger sort of relationship was with the building contractors who didn't want the construction industry to slow down. So in fact, they made it harder for migrants to return to their home countries. They made it they made it easier for them to be forced to work overtime and have longer work days and so on. So I think those challenges remain. I think one thing that Divya mentioned, obviously, that there's many approaches that could be taken. I think we need to look a little closer into the role of unionization for construction workers. A very small percentage, like I said, under a quarter of, and the situation might be different in different states, but in Karnataka, under a quarter of construction workers belong to the Construction Workers Board, to the union that advocates for them, provides public health insurance for construction workers and so on. From my conversations, there's a lot of hesitancy to join unions from construction workers because they feel like they'll upset their contractors or the building. There's obviously a long history of people being, dissuaded from joining unions. But I think that is something, there are organizations that work specifically on getting construction workers to join unions. And I think that's something worth looking into. This is also quite gendered because people who join the unions tend to be men. They do not tend to be women construction workers, but I can't speak much to that. But I think even as you work on union drives, that it's worth looking closer into who gets insured and for what purposes.
Thank you. Thanks to Leo and Joe for bringing in that very important aspects of migrant health in these conversations. We have a question from Ramya. So she says, where is the data available for research regarding migrant workers of Bangalore? Does the Labour Commissioner's Office have any information? What would be your advice to encourage research in this sector? Abha or Divya, you want to take it?
The silence actually answers the question. The fact that we don't know where to look for data. The last NSS round on migration was over a decade ago. So, I mean, every time I present this, I think in India, we are still taking it in the right spirit now because we've just got so used to it. But every time I present it to researchers from somewhere else, they're really shocked that I'm still thinking of data that's a decade old. So we have no data in terms of what migration looks like in this country. There are more recent estimates from smaller pieces of work about whether the Labour Department has. I mean, I'm sorry, I have nothing to say, and both Abha and I probably, yeah, just the silence on our face sort of explains that.
The last information that we have on temporary migration is from the NSS 2007-2008 round. So as you mentioned, it's well over a decade old. We do not have good information on this at all.
Thank you. I think that, like you say, says a lot to young researchers who want to take up these areas for research. I know we've just crossed the time, but some closing thoughts and comments from both of you.
I think we need a lot more people to sort of think about doing research at informal work sites for sure. And I think also, as I said, trying to get multiple and diverse perspectives on what it means to be workers. It's a very gendered, the nature of work is very gendered. The experience of work is very gendered. And the implications that you see in terms of health outcomes are also very gendered. Women have specific issues in terms of maternal health, adolescent health, menstrual health, and so on. So of course there is, and I'm hoping it's okay with Abha that I speak this part on behalf of her, that we would need many more researchers to join us, so that we can, in the absence of state estimates and data, at least the smaller bits and pieces that we do can together then provide us some sort of mental map of what it looks like at the national level.
Yeah, Abha, just before you give your closing thoughts, we have Usha Rao, who's done some research in urban areas. So Usha, would you like to raise your question openly? Usha? Oh, she's probably left. Okay, Abha.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, Usha. Yeah.
Hi, Bhargavi. Hi,
Yeah.
Bhargavi.
Usha, we can't hear you. Sorry.
Yeah, so I just very quickly, I think my message was maybe not as clear as I would like it to be. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So, much of this work, that's construction work, etc., comes into something we have got used to calling the informal sector. And there's a fundamental problem when we start naming 90% of our work as informal. And this very language of, around informal allows for certain kinds of laxes on the part of the state, on the part of employers. So I think we really need to look very seriously at why we are consistently using this language that was coined in 1960s when, people came and started studying different forms of employment that did not fit into, what we call formal or factory work. I mean, I can go on about it, but very quickly, I want to say that this is a fundamental, problem of how we are theorizing this kind of thing. And we need to break that. Considering that our cities are built on this kind of labor, 90% of the labor that build our cities are quote unquote informal, unorganized contract workers. So I think, being that we are beneficiaries of this, we need to really push for the state to rethink language and rethink how we talk about how we understand this kind of work.
Yes, very much. Thank you, Usha. Thank you for that those thoughts. One last question from Vasant Mysore Sorry. So he says Bangalore was heaven for migrants. They learned a lot of skills, and the pandemic robbed these skilled workers. So when they went back, the states do not have areas to utilize this skilled people. What is the way out? And he says the question is to Abha.
Actually, I think Divya answered this question really well, which is to not look at rural to urban migration in this very monolithic way. To think about how if we just developed rural spaces a little better, then we wouldn't have this sort of run towards urban areas, because urban living is aspirational for many people and so on. Once again, I don't, they do not have a way to use it. I guess they means like construction work skills.
Yeah,
I
okay. Think so too.
Yeah, I don't have a straightforward answer to this. I mean, this is inevitable that, you know, development and construction will happen in certain pockets and certain points of time. And I think it's inevitable that they will return. We are already starting to see that that people who had gone back to their native places have come back to Bangalore, have come back to Hyderabad, have come back to Gurgaon, because there is simply no work in their native places, or at least none that pay as well as construction work in urban areas. So I don't know if I should feel optimistic or pessimistic about this. It's a little bit of both, I suppose. But I just wanted to echo Divya's thoughts on encouraging researchers to join this research space. There's so much to understand and we know so little. And it is a difficult area to enter, as she pointed out, because there's a lot of resistance from builders, from contractors to letting researchers enter this space. And the ones that do allow you to enter this space are the ones who are doing right by their workers. So it takes some commitment, it takes some time, but I do encourage, I hope that other people will also join in asking these questions.
Thank you. Thank you both, Divya and Abha, for that fantastic presentation and sharing your research and the challenges ahead, and also encouraging young researchers to walk into this space. So thanks again for being part of this series. And to all our participants, please stay tuned. Next Thursday, we have Anuradha Munshi, who's going to be sharing about the Tata Mundra Ultra Mega Power Project and its impact on local communities and the financing of a mega project like that and the status of the project. So on behalf of everybody, I would like to thank Joe Atiali of CFA, Leo of ESG, my colleagues Varun, Sana, Karthik, Ashwin, Ashish, Himanshu, Malavika, our interns, for helping us put this together. They will also be putting up a report very quickly. It will be on the website, and please do follow us on the Twitter handles, and please do retweet the tweets so that it will reach the decision makers and influence them in the right way. Thank you, everyone. Thanks again, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.